I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a single door. I just stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the dining table, where I'd eaten dinner with his family for 11 years, and I made a decision so quietly that even I almost didn't notice it. That was a Thursday evening in late October. By Friday morning, I was gone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand who I was before you can understand why that moment broke something in me that I hadn't even known was fragile. My name is Gerald. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer, most of it working on infrastructure projects across the Southeast. Bridges, highway systems, water treatment facilities. The kind of work that nobody notices until something goes wrong. I retired at 61, 2 years ahead of schedule, because I'd saved carefully and because my knees had started sending me strongly worded memos about ladders and job sites. I'm not a dramatic man. I never have been. My first wife, Carol, used to say I had the emotional range of a parking garage, functional, reliable, and completely without decoration. She didn't mean it cruelly. It was accurate. We were married for 19 years before she passed from ovarian cancer. She was 52. I was 54. And for about 18 months after that, I didn't do much of anything except go through the motions of existing. Then I met Diane. She was 58 when we met, introduced through a mutual friend at a 4th of July cookout. She had silver-streaked hair she kept pulled back, a laugh that started slow and then took over her whole face, and a way of asking follow-up questions that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered. I was cautious. She was cautious, too. We dated for almost 2 years before I proposed, and I proposed only after I was sure, genuinely sure, that this was something real and not just two lonely people using each other as furniture. Diane had one child, a daughter named Renee. 34 years old when Diane and I married, so not a child in any practical sense of the word. Renee was a graphic designer who worked remotely, which meant she had the flexibility to be wherever she wanted. And what she wanted, it turned out, was to be in our house. She had her own apartment about 40 minutes away when Diane and I got married. She moved in with us 8 months later. The reason, as presented to me, was financial. Her client base had gotten thin. A couple of long-term contracts had ended, and she needed somewhere to land while she rebuilt. I understood that. I had a 4-bedroom house, only 2 of us in it, and Diane looked at me with those eyes that asked without asking. I said yes. That was 3 years ago. I want to be fair to Renee because I think fairness matters even when it's hard. She wasn't cruel in the beginning. She was distant, which I took for shyness. She was particular about her space, which I took for independence. She called Diane every day, even when they were in the same house, sometimes multiple times a day, which I took for closeness between a mother and daughter who had navigated a lot together. Diane had raised Renee mostly alone after Renee's father left when Renee was 9. They had a bond built on shared difficulty, and I respected that. I stepped carefully around it. What I didn't fully understand then was that stepping carefully can look, from certain angles, exactly like stepping aside. The first year was fine, or fine enough. Renee and I were polite. We coexisted. I gave her the guest room that had the attached bath so she'd have privacy. I stopped having my morning coffee on the back porch because she liked to work out there in the early hours, and I didn't want her to feel watched. Small adjustments, the kind you make without tallying. The second year, something shifted. I couldn't point to the exact moment. It was more like the temperature in the house changed so gradually that by the time I felt cold, I couldn't remember when I'd stopped being warm. Renee started correcting me in conversation. Not big things, small ones. The way I pronounced a word, an opinion I held about something in the news, a story I was telling about a project I'd worked on decades ago. It happened in front of Diane, and Diane would sometimes laugh a little, not unkindly, and I would let it go because I told myself it didn't matter. But then it started happening at dinner with guests. And then in front of Diane's sister when she visited for a week. And each time I let it go, the next time came a little easier for Renee and a little harder for me. I paid the mortgage. I paid the utilities. When Renee's car needed a transmission repair that cost almost $4,000, I wrote the check because Diane asked me to and because I thought it was a temporary situation. I bought groceries for 3 people on a budget designed for 2 without adjusting my tracking. I handled the lawn service, the pest control, the annual HVAC inspection. I was in every functional sense running a household that had expanded to include someone who had never agreed to any of the terms I thought we were all operating under. Renee's client work picked up about 18 months in. She started having good months, then very good months. She didn't offer to contribute to the household. I didn't ask directly because I didn't want to create a conflict with Diane, and I told myself the money wasn't the point. I was comfortable. I could absorb it, and I kept telling myself that until I started to believe that absorbing things quietly was the same as not minding them. There was a Saturday in September, about 6 weeks before everything changed, when I came home from the hardware store to find that Renee had rearranged the living room. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The reading chair I'd had for 15 years, the one that had been in the corner by the window where I read every evening, had been moved to the far wall facing away from the light. A new accent table Renee had ordered was in its place. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. I moved my chair back that afternoon. I didn't say anything about it to either of them, but I noticed that Diane didn't say anything either. Not when it happened, and not when I moved it back. I noticed that. The thing about being a quiet man is that you do a great deal of your processing alone. You turn things over internally like stones in a rock tumbler. You come out the other side smoother than you went in, which is useful. But sometimes what you've smoothed away was something that deserved to stay sharp. I had been smoothing things for 2 years by the time we reached the second Saturday in October. We were having a small dinner. Diane, Renee, Diane's friend Patricia, and Patricia's husband, whose name was Ken. Nothing formal. Just pasta, a salad, a bottle of red wine I'd been saving for a low-key occasion. I'd made the dinner. I cook reasonably well. It was something Carol and I had done together, and I'd kept the habit. We were about halfway through the meal when the conversation turned to the house. Patricia mentioned that she and Ken were considering adding a sunroom and wanted to know what I thought, given my background. I started talking about foundation considerations, about load-bearing factors, about permits and contractors, the things I actually knew something about. Renee cut me off, not aggressively. She never did anything aggressively, just smoothly, efficiently, the way you change a channel. Mom's been thinking about redoing the back porch, she said, directing the conversation entirely toward Diane. We were looking at some designs last week. The wraparound style would be amazing for this lot. We? She said we. I sat with my fork in my hand for a moment. Patricia glanced at me. Ken looked at his plate. Diane started talking about the porch design, and the conversation moved on. And I set my fork down and ate the rest of my dinner in silence. After Patricia and Ken left, after Diane had gone upstairs to call her sister, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when Renee came in to get a glass of water. She looked at me in that way she had, not unfriendly, not hostile, just utterly indifferent to my presence in a way that somehow managed to communicate volume. "You don't have to wash those tonight," she said. "The dishwasher's right there." "I know where the dishwasher is," I said. "I bought it." She paused, just for a second. Then she filled her glass and left. That was when I started paying attention in a different way. Not to the big things, because there weren't big things. It was the accumulation of small things. The way she would reference plans she and Diane had made without mentioning them to me until they were already finalized. The way she spoke over me or past me in group conversations, as if I were a piece of furniture that could speak but didn't really need to be listened to. The way she had started, very gradually, referring to the house in ways that didn't include me. This place, our home, sometimes just here, as in, it's nice here, as if I had no particular relationship to where we were standing. And through all of it, Diane was warm with me in private, and quiet in public when it would have mattered to be otherwise. I didn't confront her. I want to be honest about that. I could have, and I didn't, partly because I am who I am, and partly because I had a theory that things would settle, that Renee would move out eventually, that the situation would resolve itself if I gave it enough space. What I failed to understand was that space, in this situation, was not neutral. Space was something getting filled in around me while I stood still. The thing that finally landed differently happened on a Wednesday evening. 3 weeks after the dinner with Patricia and Ken, I had come home from my woodworking class. I'd taken it up in retirement, nothing serious, just small projects that gave my hands something to do. And I was in the garage putting my tools away. The kitchen window was open above me, and the voices carried down without any effort on my part. Diane and Renee were talking. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. I heard Renee say that she wished things could just be the two of them again, like before. I heard her say that it had never felt right, that it never would. I heard her say that she didn't understand what her mother had been thinking. And I heard Diane say softly, I know. Not push back, not defend, just, I know. I stood in the garage with a hand plane in my hand, and I didn't move for a while. I wanted to describe what I felt, but it wasn't rage. It wasn't even hurt. Not exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when you've been standing on something you thought was solid, and you shift your weight and realize, for the first time, that it has been hollow the whole time. Not that it just became hollow, that it always was, and you simply hadn't tested it in the right spot until now. I put the hand plane down very carefully. I went upstairs. I took a shower. I came down for dinner, and I was pleasant and present, and I helped clear the table, and I said good night, and I went to bed. And in the dark, I made some decisions. I didn't make them in anger. That's the part I want you to understand, because I think it matters. Decisions made in anger are reactive. What I made that night were deliberate choices, arrived at calmly, by a man who had finally run an honest assessment of his situation. The first decision, I was not going to pretend that what I'd heard hadn't happened. The second decision, I was not going to have a confrontation. That's not who I am, and it wouldn't have produced anything useful. The third decision, I was going to act. Over the next 2 weeks, I made quiet arrangements. I have a college friend, Dennis, who owns a small property management company in the next county. I called him and explained what I was looking for. Something furnished, short-term, nothing elaborate. He found me a 1-bedroom apartment about 25 minutes from the house, available on the 1st of November. I paid the deposit by phone. I updated the beneficiary on my retirement accounts, a thing that was overdue regardless. I contacted my attorney, a woman I'd used for estate planning after Carol died, and scheduled a meeting to review some documents. I opened a separate checking account and began transferring a portion of my liquid savings into it over several transactions. Nothing dramatic, just quiet reorganization. I didn't tell Diane any of this. I know how that sounds. But I want to explain the reasoning. I wasn't hiding things. I was preparing. There's a difference. I had watched what happened when I engaged, when I tried to be present and involved. I got smoothed over, talked past, made into background. So this time I was going to do something that couldn't be made into background. The first weekend of November was Diane's birthday. I had already planned to be gone by then. I had not planned on what happened the Friday before, but in some ways it made things cleaner. Renee had a friend visiting from out of town, a woman named Stacy I'd met twice, both times briefly. They were in the living room when I came downstairs on Friday evening. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop this time. I was going to the kitchen to make coffee. I heard Renee say cheerfully to Stacy, "He tends to hover. Just ignore it." And Stacy laughed. I went to the kitchen. I made my coffee. I stood at the counter and drank it and looked out the window at the backyard I'd landscaped 2 summers ago, at the garden beds Diane loved, at the fire pit I'd built from fieldstone I'd sourced myself. Then I went upstairs, quietly, and I finished packing the bag I had been adding things to for the past 10 days. The next morning, Saturday, Diane slept in. I got up at my normal time. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, the one I had bought, in the house I owned, in the life I had built. And I wrote 2 letters. The first was to Diane. It was not angry, and it was not cold. I told her what I had heard in the garage. I told her what I had heard at dinner through the window. I told her that I had loved her genuinely, and that I still did, but that I had spent 3 years becoming invisible in my own home, and that I was no longer willing to do that. I told her that I needed her to understand the difference between loving her daughter and disappearing for her daughter. I told her I had moved some things, and that I hoped we could talk when she was ready, but that I needed space and time to think, and so did she. The second was a single page that I left on top of my letter. It was a copy of the utility accounts, the mortgage documents, and the household expenses I had been covering for the past 3 years, with the monthly totals outlined clearly. Not as an accusation, as information, because I thought Diane deserved to have the full picture of what the last 3 years had actually looked like, written down in plain language, since I had never said it out loud. I set both pages on the kitchen table, weighted down with the spare house key, not my key, just the spare, and I picked up my bag. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen for a moment. I didn't shout. I didn't leave a mess. I didn't do anything dramatic. I closed the door quietly behind me, and I drove to my apartment, and I put my bag down, and I sat by the window and had a cup of coffee in the first silence I'd had in 3 years. That was entirely mine. Diane called at 10:47 that morning. I let it go to voicemail. She called 3 more times by noon. I texted her once. "I'm safe. I need a few days. Please read what I left." Renee called once. I didn't respond. Dennis, bless him, invited me to dinner that Saturday night, and we talked about nothing important for 3 hours, and it was exactly what I needed. It was 11 days before I agreed to meet Diane. She had asked to come to the apartment, and I said no, not to be unkind, but because I wanted neutral ground. We met at a coffee shop about equidistant from both of us. She looked tired in the way people look when they've been carrying something. I probably did too. She had read the letters. She had read the financial summary. She had, she told me, also had a long conversation with Renee after I left. The kind of conversation, I gathered, that had been overdue for some time. She didn't give me the details. I didn't ask for them. She said she was sorry. She said it more than once, and she said it in the specific way that meant she understood what she was apologizing for, which matters more than the words themselves. She said she hadn't known how bad it had gotten because she hadn't let herself know, and she understood that not letting yourself know is its own kind of choice. I told her I appreciated that. I meant it. I also told her what I needed going forward, if there was going to be a going forward, that I was not willing to return to a house where I was made to feel like a tenant in my own life, that if Renee continued to live with us, there would need to be explicit spoken agreements, not my interpretation of unspoken signals, but actual words, that I needed Diane to be my partner in our home, which meant being present when her daughter was rewriting the terms of my presence, that if she wasn't able to do that, then I thought the kindest thing we could do for each other was to be honest about what this marriage actually was. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I've been so afraid of her being unhappy that I stopped noticing you were. I sat with that for a moment. That has to change, I said. I know, she said. But this time she wasn't saying it to Renee. She was saying it to me. We talked for almost 2 hours. I drove home to my apartment afterward and sat again by the window. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not resolution exactly, but possibility. The sense that there was still a decision to be made, and that I was the one who got to make it. I stayed at the apartment for another 2 weeks after that. In that time, Diane and I spoke every day. Some of the conversations were hard. Some of them were the kind of quiet and honest conversations we'd had when we were first getting to know each other, before the texture of daily life had gotten layered over everything. Renee found her own apartment. I don't know the details of how that conversation went, and I didn't need to. What I knew was that when I drove past the house one evening to pick up a few things I'd left, there was a moving truck in the driveway. I parked down the street and waited until it was gone. I'm back in the house now. It's been about 6 weeks. It's quieter than it was. Some mornings I sit in my reading chair, the one by the window, in the corner where it belongs, and I drink my coffee and I look out at the yard and I think about what a strange thing it is to reclaim something you never actually relinquished, just forgot for a while, that it was yours. Diane and I are doing the work. That's the honest way to say it. We're seeing a counselor, which was my idea, and which I say without any embarrassment, because I spent too much of my life believing that getting help was something other than practical. We have hard conversations, and then we have easier ones, and the ratio is slowly shifting in a direction I feel cautiously good about. I'm not going to tell you it's fixed. It's not. Marriages don't get fixed the way machinery gets fixed. You don't identify the broken part, replace it, and run the diagnostic again. What you do is stay in the room. You keep talking. You tell the truth, even when it would be easier to smooth it over. And you trust that the other person can handle the truth, because you've already seen what happens when you assume they can't. I don't know if Renee and I will ever have a relationship that amounts to anything. I hold that question loosely. I'm not angry at her, which might surprise you. I think she is a woman who was shaped by a long stretch of difficult years, and who learned somewhere in there that the way to protect what mattered was to control it. I understand that impulse even if I'm not willing to be on the receiving end of it. What I do know is this. I spent 31 years building structures designed to last. Bridges, waterways, foundations. The whole discipline is about knowing your load limits, understanding what the structure can bear and what will crack it. I was not good at applying that knowledge to myself. I let myself become a load-bearing wall that nobody checked on, and I held it all up and said nothing. And one day I had to walk out of my own house quietly, because I had forgotten that I was allowed to say when something was too heavy. I remember it now. That's the thing I left on the table. Not just a letter, not just numbers on a page. What I left was the full weight of 3 years of silence, written down plainly, so that the people who had grown comfortable in that silence could finally feel what it had cost. I don't regret leaving. I only regret waiting as long as I did. If you're in a position right now where you're carrying something like this, where you've been so careful, so accommodating, so determined not to be difficult that you've made yourself into something like furniture, I want you to hear this. You're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to name what's happening. You're allowed to walk out of a room and say, quietly and without drama, "This is not acceptable to me," and then make decisions accordingly. You don't have to shout. You don't have to break anything. You just have to stop pretending you don't notice that you're disappearing. I noticed. That was enough to start.